Most people believe people-pleasing is kindness. That is the first illusion. You learned early that harmony feels safer than tension. That agreement smooths the air in a room. That nodding quietly can dissolve a conflict before it even begins. So you trained yourself to do it without thinking. You anticipate reactions, soften your tone, adjust your opinions, and move through conversations like someone carefully rearranging fragile glass. From the outside, it looks like generosity. From the inside, it feels like control. But listen carefully, because this is where the misunderstanding begins to unravel. People-pleasing is not kindness. It is fear, wearing a polite mask. The truth is quieter and more uncomfortable. When you constantly try to make everyone comfortable, you are not serving them. You are protecting yourself from rejection. Think about how it actually works in daily life. A colleague takes credit for something you contributed to, and you feel the small sting rise in your chest. Yet you smile and let the moment pass because you do not want to create tension. A friend makes a comment that crosses a boundary, and instead of addressing it, you laugh it off, convincing yourself it is not worth the friction. In that moment, you believe you are maintaining peace. But that is not peace. It is silence purchased with your own authority. And here is the brutal part. The more you practice this silence, the more people begin to rely on it. At first, they test the boundary unintentionally. Someone interrupts you during a meeting and you allow it. Someone assigns you extra work because they assume you will not object. Someone in your personal life begins to lean on you emotionally without ever asking how you are holding up. You tell yourself these are small things. They are not. They are signals. And in every human environment, signals accumulate quickly. Think about it. Every group, whether it is a workplace, a family, or a circle of friends, operates on invisible negotiations of power. No one announces these negotiations openly. They happen through tone, reaction, hesitation, and silence. The moment you consistently avoid conflict, you begin sending a clear message without realizing it. You are telling everyone around you that your boundaries are flexible, that your comfort can be negotiated away, that your presence in the room is designed to support the stability of others rather than the expression of yourself. Most people never notice they are communicating this, but the group notices immediately. Now watch what happens when this pattern repeats for months or years. Your reputation quietly forms around it. People begin describing you in flattering language. They say you are easygoing. They say you are understanding. They say you are the person who never creates problems. At first, those descriptions feel good. They sound like praise, but they carry a hidden cost. Because once a group defines you that way, the moment you stop behaving like that version of yourself, something interesting happens. The room shifts. You have probably felt this before. The first time you finally say no to something you previously tolerated. Maybe it is a request at work that would push you past your limits. Maybe it is a social obligation you no longer want to carry. Maybe it is a conversation where someone expects you to absorb criticism without response. And suddenly, when you refuse, people react with confusion. Not anger at first. Confusion, because you have disrupted the role they assigned to you. This is the moment that reveals the mechanism behind people-pleasing. When you say no, the group does not simply evaluate the situation in front of them. They compare your response to the version of you they became accustomed to. In their minds, you have changed. Even if what you are doing now is simply expressing a boundary that should have existed from the beginning, that is the trap. The longer you maintain the pleasing persona, the more shocking your independence becomes when it finally appears. And here is where most people make their second mistake. The moment they sense this tension, they retreat. They apologize for setting the boundary. They soften their words. They say things like, "I'm sorry. I just have a lot going on right now." They dilute the message until it sounds temporary. But understand the psychology behind that instinct. You are not apologizing for the situation. You are apologizing for the discomfort your autonomy created in others. And when you do that, you quietly restore the old arrangement. Listen carefully. Social systems reward consistency more than fairness. If you train people to see you as endlessly accommodating, they will unconsciously expect that behavior to continue. It becomes part of the environment. When you remove it, they experience the same irritation they would feel if the lighting in a room suddenly changed or if a familiar route to work was closed. The disruption feels personal even when it is not. Think about a common situation. You are part of a team where one person always volunteers for extra tasks. Everyone appreciates it. So the pattern continues. Months later, that person decides to stop overextending themselves and begins declining requests. Instantly, the group perceives them differently. The same action that would be normal from someone else now feels selfish coming from them. Why? Because they changed the expectation they helped create. This is why people-pleasing becomes a quiet prison. Not because others are malicious, but because human beings adapt quickly to whatever behavior stabilizes the group. If you stabilize the group by sacrificing your own position, the group will unconsciously encourage you to keep doing exactly that. Here is the brutal truth. The moment you begin to reclaim your boundaries, you will disappoint people. Not everyone, but enough to make you uncomfortable. Some will question your motives. Some will interpret your change as distance. A few may even accuse you of becoming cold. And if you have spent years defining your identity through approval, that reaction can feel unbearable. But look deeper at the structure behind that discomfort. Approval is one of the most subtle forms of social currency. When you consistently earn it by pleasing others, it feels like safety. You feel liked, included, valued. Yet the moment your behavior stops producing that currency, you realize something unsettling. Much of the approval you received was conditional. It was attached to the role you played. Think about that for a moment. Not you, the role. And this is where the real transformation begins. Because once you see this dynamic clearly, the entire game changes. Instead of measuring your behavior by how comfortable it makes others, you begin observing how it shapes your reputation. Reputation is not built on constant agreement. It is built on predictable standards. People respect boundaries not because they enjoy them, but because they understand them. Consider someone in your environment who rarely explains themselves, yet others still respect their decisions. That person is not necessarily more intelligent or more charismatic than you. Often the difference is much simpler. They never trained people to expect unlimited access to their time and emotional energy. Their boundaries were visible from the beginning. Now compare that with the psychology of the people pleaser. You spent years smoothing every edge in your personality so no one would feel friction. But friction is not always a problem. Sometimes it is the only signal that tells others where your limits are. Think about the small, everyday situations where this dynamic unfolds. A group chat where someone makes a sarcastic remark about you and everyone waits to see if you will laugh along with it. A meeting where your idea is quietly redirected to someone else while you sit there deciding whether speaking up would seem confrontational. A relationship where you constantly adjust your plans, your schedule, even your preferences just to keep things calm. Each of those moments contains a silent negotiation, and every time you choose comfort over clarity, you strengthen the same pattern. Now you might be thinking something important. If people-pleasing is so costly, why do so many intelligent people fall into it? The answer is psychological conditioning. Most people learned early that approval equals safety. Perhaps as a child you noticed that being agreeable made adults happier. Maybe conflict in your environment felt dangerous. So you developed the ability to anticipate moods and adjust your behavior accordingly. Over time, that skill became part of your identity. At first it worked. It helped you navigate unpredictable situations. It made you socially perceptive. But the problem with survival strategies is that they do not automatically disappear when the environment changes. What once protected you eventually begins to limit you. And here is the paradox that few people are willing to confront. The more emotionally intelligent you are, the easier it is to become a people pleaser, because you can read subtle signals others miss. You notice shifts in tone, expressions, small moments of tension. You know exactly how to smooth them out. But the more you do that, the more invisible your own needs become. This is why breaking the people-pleasing habit feels so uncomfortable at first. You are not just changing a behavior, you are challenging a deeply ingrained strategy that once kept your social world stable. And stability is seductive. But stability built on self-erasure always carries a price. Think about the energy required to constantly monitor other people's reactions, the quiet calculations in your mind before you speak, the mental rehearsals before sending a message, the careful adjustments in tone so no one feels criticized. Over time, that effort becomes exhausting. Yet because you perform it automatically, you rarely notice how much of your attention it consumes. Now imagine something different. Imagine walking into a room without that constant monitoring, speaking with clarity instead of cautious diplomacy, allowing the occasional moment of discomfort without rushing to fix it. At first it feels risky. You worry that people will misinterpret you or withdraw their approval. But something interesting happens when you stop over-managing the emotional atmosphere around you. People begin revealing their real reactions. Some respect you more, some become distant, some test your new boundaries to see whether they are temporary. And that moment, when the environment reorganizes around your changed behavior, is where the true lesson begins to emerge. Because the people who only valued your compliance will gradually drift away, while those who respect your clarity will remain. But that transition does not happen instantly. There is a period of adjustment where the old expectations collide with your new behavior. And in that period, you will feel pressure to return to the familiar role. Someone might say, "You've changed lately." Another person might ask if something is wrong. A colleague might hint that you seem less cooperative than before. That is the moment you must understand what is really happening. They are not responding to your boundary itself. They are responding to the loss of the convenience your old behavior provided. And once you see that mechanism clearly, something inside you begins to shift. Because you realize the uncomfortable truth that has been sitting quietly beneath all of this. The version of you that pleased everyone was never sustainable. It required constant self-adjustment, constant emotional labor, constant negotiation with the expectations of others. It worked only because you were willing to carry the weight. Now ask yourself a strategic question. What happens when you stop carrying it? What happens when you stop carrying it is not chaos. As your mind once predicted, it is revelation. The moment the weight is no longer on your shoulders, the structure that depended on it becomes visible. Conversations change tone. Requests begin to sound different. The same people who once praised your generosity now pause before asking you for something, because the quiet assumption that you will automatically agree has disappeared. At first, this shift is subtle. A colleague hesitates before adding one more task to your workload. A friend who used to unload their frustrations without restraint now asks if you have time to talk. These are small adjustments, but they reveal something important. Your previous behavior was not simply kindness. It was a system others unconsciously learned to rely on. This is where many people become uneasy, because they begin to see the architecture of their relationships more clearly than they ever did before. When you stop performing the role of emotional stabilizer, you discover who was truly interested in you and who was primarily interested in what you provided. It is not always malicious. Often the other person does not even realize they were leaning on your constant accommodation. That is how social habits work. They develop slowly, like grooves worn into stone by running water. For years, you may have allowed people to step into those grooves until the pattern felt natural to everyone involved. Think about a familiar situation. In a group project at work, you are the one who smooths over disagreements. When two colleagues clash, you quietly redirect the conversation. When deadlines approach, you absorb extra tasks so the team does not feel pressure. Over time, this behavior becomes expected. No one formally assigns you that role, yet everyone assumes you will fill it. And then one day, you stop. You simply do your portion of the work and leave the rest to the group. Suddenly, tension appears. Someone asks why you seem less involved. Another person subtly implies that the team atmosphere has changed. But look closely at what is happening. The group is not upset because you did something wrong. They are reacting to the disappearance of a service they had grown accustomed to receiving for free. Here is the brutal truth. When you consistently manage other people's emotional comfort, you train them to outsource that responsibility to you. They do not learn to handle their own discomfort because you intercept it before it reaches them. That might feel compassionate in the moment, but over time it creates an imbalance. You become the emotional buffer in every interaction, absorbing friction so others can remain at ease. The moment you withdraw from that role, the friction does not vanish. It simply returns to its original owners. You felt this before, didn't you? That strange sensation when you finally hold a boundary and the room becomes quiet for a moment. No one knows exactly how to react. The conversation pauses. Someone shifts in their chair. The dynamic has changed, and everyone senses it. This silence often triggers your old instinct to repair the tension immediately. You might feel the urge to explain yourself, to reassure people that you are still agreeable, to soften the edge of your refusal. That urge is the final reflex of the people-pleasing habit. It is the mind's attempt to restore the environment to its previous equilibrium. But consider something carefully. Silence is not always a problem. Sometimes it is the space where a new balance forms. When you refuse to rush in and smooth everything over, others begin adjusting their behavior. They learn that your time is not automatically available, that your agreement is not guaranteed, that your boundaries exist, whether they find them convenient or not. This adjustment process can feel uncomfortable, yet it is the only way a healthier structure emerges. Now watch what happens over time. The people who respected you primarily because you were easy to manage will gradually lose interest, not in dramatic confrontations, but through subtle distancing. They stop including you in certain conversations. They interact with you more cautiously. Occasionally, they might even label you differently than before. Words like difficult, distant, or guarded appear in casual descriptions of your personality. That is the cost of breaking the old contract. And make no mistake, it was a contract, even if no one ever signed it. Most people never realize they are participating in such agreements. They assume relationships are built purely on affection or shared interests. But beneath the surface, there are always exchanges taking place. Attention is exchanged for validation. Support is exchanged for loyalty. Agreement is exchanged for acceptance. In the case of the people-pleaser, the exchange is particularly clear. You provided emotional ease for others, and in return, you received approval. That approval can feel intoxicating. Being the person everyone describes as kind and accommodating carries a certain social prestige. People trust you. They speak well of you. They recommend you as someone reliable. Yet, that reputation is fragile, because it depends on constant performance. The moment you stop delivering the behavior that produced the praise, the reputation begins to shift. Think about it in strategic terms. If your identity in a group depends entirely on being agreeable, then your influence in that group is extremely limited. Why? Because influence requires the ability to disagree without losing your position. A person who cannot challenge a decision, reject a request, or express a different perspective without fearing social consequences does not hold real authority. They hold conditional approval. This is why the transformation away from people-pleasing feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory. You are trading conditional approval for something far more stable, self-respect, and predictable boundaries. But the mind resists this trade at first because the rewards are delayed. Approval is immediate and visible. Respect, on the other hand, develops slowly and often appears only after a period of tension. Listen carefully. People do not respect someone who agrees with everything they say. They may appreciate it temporarily. But appreciation is not the same as respect. Respect grows when others realize that your behavior follows a consistent internal standard rather than the shifting moods of the group. When they see that certain lines cannot be crossed, certain expectations cannot be imposed, certain requests will receive a calm but firm refusal, they begin to understand the shape of your character. Think about someone you quietly admire in your own life. It might be a colleague, a mentor, or even a friend who seems immune to the social pressure that controls most people's decisions. That person is not rude. They are not aggressive. Yet when they say no, the conversation ends there. No long explanations, no apology, no nervous laughter to soften the refusal. They simply maintain their boundary and allow the room to adjust. That behavior sends a powerful signal. It tells everyone around them that their identity is not negotiated through approval. Their choices come from an internal compass rather than external pressure. And here is the paradox. At first, this kind of clarity can make others uncomfortable, but over time it becomes strangely reassuring. People know exactly where that person stands. Now contrast that with the experience of interacting with someone who constantly adapts themselves to maintain harmony. Their words change depending on the audience. Their opinions shift depending on the dominant voice in the room. Their boundaries appear flexible one day and rigid the next. That unpredictability might seem polite on the surface, but it quietly erodes trust, because no one can tell which version of that person is real. Here is the strategic insight most people overlook. The purpose of boundaries is not to create distance. It is to create clarity. When others understand your limits, they stop guessing. They know what behavior will receive cooperation and what behavior will not. That clarity simplifies social interactions rather than complicating them. But before you reach that stage, there is an unavoidable phase where your environment tests the change. Someone will ask for a favor in the same casual tone they used before, expecting the familiar response. Someone else will make a comment that assumes you will quietly absorb it. And when you respond differently, the reaction will reveal more about the relationship than any conversation ever could. You might hear phrases like, "You used to be so easygoing," or "I didn't think this would be a big deal." Those sentences sound harmless, yet they carry an implicit message. They are attempts to pull you back into the old pattern by reminding you of the identity others preferred you to have. The temptation to comply can be strong, especially if you dislike conflict. That is the moment discipline becomes essential, because breaking the people-pleasing habit is not a single decision. It is a series of small choices repeated over time. Each time you maintain a boundary without apology, the new pattern becomes stronger. Each time you resist the urge to over-explain your decisions, the environment adjusts a little more. Eventually, something surprising happens. The same people who once seemed unsettled by your boundaries begin respecting them, not necessarily because they agree with them, but because they recognize that they are consistent. And consistency is one of the most powerful signals a person can send. Think about it. When someone knows your reaction in advance, they stop wasting energy trying to manipulate the outcome. If they understand that certain requests will always receive a calm refusal, they eventually stop making those requests. If they know that certain jokes or comments will not be tolerated, they stop using them around you. The social environment reorganizes itself around the limits you demonstrate. This is why the destruction of the people-pleasing habit feels so dramatic. It is not just a personal shift. It alters the entire network of expectations surrounding you. Some connections will strengthen, others will fade, but the ones that remain will be built on a more honest foundation. Now, there is another layer to this transformation that many people overlook. When you stop constantly managing other people's emotions, you recover a surprising amount of mental space. The energy you once spent anticipating reactions becomes available for something else. Clear thinking, strategic planning, honest communication. You begin noticing things that were previously hidden by your own effort to keep the peace. Subtle manipulations in conversations, the way certain individuals rely on guilt or obligation to secure cooperation, the patterns of influence that operate quietly in every group. When you are no longer trying to appease everyone, you can finally observe the social dynamics unfolding around you. And observation is power. Because once you see these dynamics clearly, you can choose how to respond rather than reacting automatically. A request becomes a decision rather than an obligation. A disagreement becomes an exchange of perspectives rather than a threat to your acceptance. the entire landscape of your interactions begins to change. But be careful. This clarity comes with a responsibility. It is tempting, after recognizing how often people rely on your compliance, to swing to the opposite extreme and reject every request or challenge every opinion. That reaction feels empowering for a moment, yet it creates a different kind of imbalance. True authority does not come from constant resistance. It comes from deliberate choice. Sometimes you will still agree to help someone. Sometimes you will still compromise in a discussion. The difference is that these actions will come from intention rather than pressure. You will choose cooperation because it aligns with your priorities, not because you fear disappointing someone. That shift might seem subtle from the outside, but internally it changes everything. You are no longer negotiating your identity with every interaction. You are expressing it. And once you begin operating from that place, something fascinating happens in your relationships. The people who remain in your circle start interacting with the real version of you rather than the carefully adjusted persona you once presented. Conversations become more direct. Agreements become clearer. Disagreements become less dramatic because they no longer threaten the illusion of constant harmony. At this point, you might notice a final, unexpected realization emerging. The approval you once chased so carefully was never as valuable as you believed. It felt powerful because it was easy to measure. Smiles, compliments, invitations, positive reactions in conversations, yet much of it was tied to the convenience you provided. Real respect looks different. It is quieter. Sometimes it even includes moments of disagreement, but it carries a weight that approval never had, because it is directed at who you are rather than how well you perform a role. And that realization brings you to the threshold of the final lesson, the one most people never reach. Because once you truly stop pleasing everyone, you begin to understand the deeper structure behind human interactions. You begin to understand the deeper structure behind human interactions. And that understanding changes the way you move through the world. Not dramatically, not with loud declarations or theatrical displays of independence, but with a quiet shift in posture. The same rooms, the same conversations, the same people remain around you. Yet something fundamental in the dynamic has altered. You are no longer trying to maintain the emotional equilibrium of every situation. You are simply present within it. Most people never reach this point because they retreat the moment discomfort appears. They mistake tension for danger. The moment someone frowns, withdraws warmth, or reacts with mild irritation, they interpret it as a signal that something has gone wrong, so they rush to repair the atmosphere. They soften their position. They apologize unnecessarily. They restore the pleasant surface of the interaction, even if it costs them their clarity. This habit becomes so automatic that they rarely question it. But here is the brutal truth. Not every discomfort needs to be repaired. Sometimes discomfort is simply the natural consequence of two people expressing different needs. When you stop treating that moment like a crisis, something surprising happens. The tension often resolves itself without your intervention. The other person adjusts. The conversation continues. Life moves forward. Think about a simple scene. Someone asks you for a favor that would disrupt your schedule. In the past, you would have hesitated, searching for the least offensive way to decline. You might have invented an excuse, or agreed reluctantly while telling yourself you would handle the inconvenience later. Now imagine answering differently, calmly, directly, without apology. I can't do that this week. The sentence is short, almost ordinary, yet in that moment you have changed the entire negotiation. The other person pauses. Perhaps they look surprised. Perhaps they ask once more to confirm. But notice what happens next. The world does not collapse. The relationship does not disintegrate. The conversation simply moves in another direction. That small moment reveals something important about human interaction. Many of the fears that sustain people-pleasing exist primarily in your imagination. You assumed that refusing a request would create conflict. You assumed that expressing disagreement would damage the relationship. You assumed that others would withdraw their respect the moment you stopped accommodating them. But when you test those assumptions, they often dissolve. What remains is a clearer, more honest interaction between two individuals who understand each other's limits. Of course, there will still be moments where your boundaries provoke resistance. Some people will push back. Some will attempt to persuade you to reconsider. A few may even try subtle tactics to make you feel guilty for refusing. This is where the final layer of the people-pleasing habit reveals itself. Because the real challenge is not saying no once. It is maintaining that position when someone tries to negotiate it away. You have seen this pattern before. Someone asks for something unreasonable. You decline politely, and they respond with a sentence that sounds harmless but carries emotional pressure. It would really mean a lot to me. Or you're the only person who can help. Or the classic phrase, delivered with quiet disappointment. I thought you were more supportive than that. These statements are not always manipulative in a malicious sense. Often they are simply the other person reaching for influence. But influence only works if you accept the premise behind it. Think about the logic hidden inside those sentences. They attempt to convert your boundary into a moral failure. If you refuse, you are not simply unavailable. You are unsupportive. You are selfish. You are disappointing. The goal is not to argue the practical reality of the request. The goal is to make you uncomfortable enough to abandon your position. Now watch what happens when you refuse to play that game. Instead of defending yourself, instead of explaining your reasons in detail, you simply repeat your boundary calmly. No hostility, no elaborate justification, just clarity. The first time you do this, it feels unnatural, almost harsh. But the more you practice it, the more you realize something important. Boundaries do not require debate. Most people who pressure others into compliance rely on a simple psychological mechanism. They assume that if they introduce enough emotional discomfort, the other person will eventually surrender. When that mechanism stops working on you, their strategy loses its effectiveness. They may attempt once or twice more, but eventually they move on. And this is where the deeper transformation becomes visible. When people understand that your boundaries are not temporary moods but stable features of your character, they stop testing them. The energy once spent negotiating your compliance disappears. Interactions become more straightforward. Requests become more reasonable. The environment reorganizes around the reality of who you are rather than the convenience you once provided. Listen carefully, because this is the part most people misunderstand. The goal of destroying the people-pleaser inside you is not to become cold or indifferent. It is to become precise. Precision in your words. Precision in your commitments. Precision in the way you allocate your attention and energy. When you stop agreeing to everything, the things you do agree to carry more weight. Imagine two people offering help. One says yes to every request, spreading themselves thin until their promises become unreliable. The other accepts fewer obligations but fulfills them consistently. Over time, which person becomes more trusted? The one whose agreement actually means something. Scarcity creates value, even in social interactions. That is why people who maintain clear boundaries often appear calmer than those who constantly accommodate others. They are not juggling 1,000 silent obligations in their mind. They are not trying to remember which promises they made to preserve harmony. Their commitments are deliberate. Their time is structured. Their energy is directed toward what matters. But there is another consequence of this shift that few people anticipate. When you stop pleasing everyone, you also stop resenting them. Think about that for a moment. Much of the quiet frustration people feel in their relationships comes from obligations they never truly chose. They agreed out of politeness, fear, or habit, and later they carry the burden of that decision with silent irritation. When you begin choosing your commitments consciously, that resentment fades. If you help someone, it is because you decided the action was worthwhile. If you attend an event, it is because you genuinely wanted to be there. The emotional clarity that follows is remarkable. Your relationships become lighter, not heavier. And here is the paradox that completes the transformation. When you stop trying to be liked by everyone, you often become more respected by the people who matter. Not because you are trying to impress them, but because your behavior communicates authenticity. There is no hidden negotiation behind your words. What you say reflects what you actually think. That authenticity has a magnetic quality. People feel it even if they cannot explain it. They sense that interacting with you requires honesty because you are no longer participating in the polite illusions that dominate most conversations. Some will find that refreshing, others will find it unsettling. Both reactions are useful signals. Over time, you will notice a subtle but profound change in the kinds of relationships that surround you. The superficial ones, built primarily on convenience or emotional dependence, gradually fade into the background. In their place appear connections based on mutual respect. Conversations become deeper. Cooperation becomes more genuine. Disagreements become less threatening because neither side feels obligated to maintain a fragile facade of harmony. At this stage, the old people-pleasing identity begins to feel distant, almost unfamiliar. You remember the constant vigilance, the quiet anxiety about disappointing someone, the endless effort to smooth every edge in every interaction. It seems strange now, like a role you once played in a long performance, a role that required enormous energy, yet delivered very little freedom. The freedom you experience now is quieter than you imagined. It is not dramatic independence or rebellious defiance. It is the simple ability to move through your life without constantly negotiating your identity with the expectations of others. You speak when you have something meaningful to say. You decline when a request does not align with your priorities. You help when your values genuinely support the action. And that brings us to the final realization, the one that transforms this entire journey from a defensive strategy into a form of quiet power. The moment you stop pleasing everyone, you begin to understand that your role in social life was never to maintain universal approval. That goal is impossible. No one holds it for long. Approval shifts with mood, circumstance, and convenience. Chasing it is like trying to hold water in your hands. What actually shapes your position in the world is something far more stable, the clarity of your character. When people know where you stand, they may not always agree with you, but they know how to interact with you. When your words match your actions, your reputation becomes predictable, and predictability in human relationships is a powerful form of trust. So the destruction of the people-pleaser inside you is not the loss of kindness. It is the removal of fear from your kindness. You can still be generous. You can still listen, support, and cooperate. But those actions will come from choice rather than obligation. And that difference changes everything. Because once kindness becomes voluntary rather than compulsory, it stops being a performance. It becomes a reflection of who you truly are. And when you live from that place, something remarkable happens. You no longer need everyone to like you. You only need to respect yourself.